So for our first session, we're going to be looking to the future of the insurance industry with the help of two experts today. First, I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Dr. Nicola Millard, one of the UK's top customer experience influencers and expert in customer trends. Currently Principal Innovation Partner at BT, Nicola's expertise covers futurology, research, usability, customer service, marketing and business consultant. She's an award-winning presenter with 2 TED Talks and hundreds of conference panel and sharing keynote sessions under her belt. I've had the great privilege of hearing her talk many, many times, and I'm absolutely thrilled to introduce her to you today. Secondly, I'd like to welcome award-winning futurist Matthew Griffin. Matthew is the founder and CEO of the World Futures Forum and the 311 Institute, which is a global futures consultancy. Regularly featured in the global media, Matthew specializes in identifying and in tracking and explaining the impacts of hundreds of revolutionary emerging technologies on global culture, industry, and society. So please welcome Matthew and Nicola. Hi, Matthew.
Hi, everyone.
Nicola, could we maybe start with you? I think with everything that has been happening, it would be fair to say that the pandemic has fast forwarded some of the working trends that had been looking at sort of not too distant future trends. But can these now lead the way, do you think, for a more diverse workforce? And more importantly, how do you think that these are going to end up benefiting companies in the long run?
Sure. Well, just as a bit of context, I've been looking at the future of work for probably about 10 years now, and actually debatably before that as well, because BT was doing a lot around experimenting about work well, my first job in BT back in 1992 was our first home working trial, oddly enough. So obviously I was only 6 at the time, but you know, we've been trying different ways of working for a long time, but we've had a formal program around the future of work for quite a number of years. And we've been talking obviously about digital transformation for a long time. And to be honest, you know, the technology back in 92 was not there. Now it kind of is. And I keep saying it's almost a good time to have a pandemic at the moment, because had we had it 10 years ago, we might have struggled a little bit more because, again, the technology was not quite there. So a lot of the stuff that we were talking about before the pandemic was certainly around, you know, if we want a diverse workforce, we need to recognize that everyone is different and that everyone works in different ways. And a lot of what we were looking at prior to the pandemic was, how do you open up the choices in terms of allowing people to work in the most productive way for them, and not imposing, you know, you have to be in the office, or you have to work 9 to 5, or you have to work a 5-day week. All of those things, I think we were challenging prior to the pandemic. And to be honest, the trouble that we had was not about the technology, it was about the culture around the technology, around people pushing back and going, oh no, we can't possibly have our workforce working from home. And a lot of that's rooted down in trust, to be perfectly frank. And I'm a psychologist by background, so things like trust makes me very excited, because there's a lot of things that we can try and embed in the ways that, you know, if we're going to rethink the ways that we work, actually trust is one of those absolute foundation things. But so that's the first thing, around acknowledging that if we want a diverse workforce, we also need to provide a diverse way of working. I would say if we turn the clock back to 1992 and the trial that we did back in 92, which was called the Inverness experiment well, it was based in Inverness, so that's probably why. We actually worked a set of 11 volunteers for a whole year, and it was a proper experiment. You know, we had a control group, and I was a very small part of the psychological monitoring team, because nobody had kind of done that for that long before, and we thought they might go nuts. But I think one of the things that we found then was actually they didn't. They started to find community in slightly different places. As one lady put it, I found out who my neighbours were and learned to cook a lot more. And I think we're all doing that now.
Yeah.
Completely right. So, you know, I think when we sort of bring the experience right up till now, a lot of the things that we learned during the transition phase, and obviously BT was we embraced home working wholeheartedly by about the year 2000. I think we found, in terms of diversity, one of the key things that we hadn't really anticipated was a lot of our women returners after maternity leave did come back, and we had at one point a 97% return rate because we offered a lot more flexible options in terms of how you could work. It wasn't around the traditional office 9 to 5. We gave people options, and that for us, certainly in terms of diversity and innovation, because you need a diverse workforce to innovate. I'm in an innovation team. We need diverse ideas. So we can't impose that one size fit all solution. But I would say, that was one of the unintended almost consequences of offering more flexibility. But I think as with a lot of tech companies, we kind of fell out of love a little bit with home working. Because I think firstly, most of us have found that permanent home working is actually quite difficult for most of us. I'm not normally a home worker, but I think I'm almost itching to get back out occasionally. So then we have to wrestle these hybrids. And I keep saying, when everyone is digital, it's kind of almost a level playing field. We're all in little boxes. Everyone has a right to say things. Nobody is excluded. Certainly one of the brilliant things about having a lot of virtual conferences at the moment is one of my friends who's in a wheelchair, lives in Scotland. It's a big commute to come down to London to go to a conference, and she's been able to participate in a lot of those things simply because they have been virtual. She hasn't got to travel. So I think that sort of inclusivity piece is one of the big learnings coming out of the pandemic. And I think the question there is, how do we sustain this? Well, inevitably we offer more choices, which might be the office. It might be the office, the co-working space. The advantage there is with the climate emergency, having somewhere I can go that's not the house, but isn't a large commute, that isn't maybe within a 15-minute walk or a bicycle ride to where I live, but is, a community space where I can work. When you get those hybrid models, actually, you probably still want to do digital by default when you kind of talk to people and conference with people. So I keep saying, having a hybrid where you've got half the people physically co-located and half of them remote actually means that your common ground is not the office, it's actually digital. So we've got this kind of whole concept around smart working digital by default, but almost as an accident, that does promote, I think, a lot more inclusivity. And again, it depends how you manage it, but I think you can get a lot of diverse ideas through by being remote by default.
Absolutely. And Matthew, on that point, what sort of opportunities do you see? And obviously the whole digital remote working plays a part in this, but what sort of opportunities might the pandemic actually provide for the insurance industry? I know that we've talked before about the points about, the amount of risk in the world, but it's also a huge opportunity for a couple of industries, insurance being one of them. But what are your thoughts?
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the biggest changes that's coming around because of the pandemic is this whole conversation, this kind of new debate. It's about the future of work. Work from home. I actually don't really think it's work from home. It's work from anywhere. Let's face it. Whether you're on a beach in Ireland, Barbados are opening their shores up to anyone that wants to go and work over there for a year. Very nice if you can do that. But when you have a look at the pandemic, the other thing that this sort of pandemic has accelerated is the use of telehealth, telemedicine, and all these kinds of things. And when you have a look at working from home, one of the biggest sort of issues that we potentially have is that of managing people's wellness and mental health as they work from home. So as we're sort of interacting here, basically you're hearing audio, you're hearing my voice, basically you're seeing my face on high definition, so I apologize for that. That's it, need a bit of a shave. But what we can do is increasingly from a technology standpoint, we can actually use artificial intelligence and machine vision, basically in these web cameras, in these Zoom platforms and conference platforms, to detect my heart rate, my blood pressure. We can look at microfacial expressions and all these sorts of other things, but you can use the audio from my voice to tell whether or not I'm depressed, whether I have the onset of PTSD, Alzheimer's, all these kinds of things. So what we actually have here, even though you might think you're looking at a live video stream, what you're actually looking at basically is a platform that you can use and leverage to monitor the well-being of your global distributed workforce, right down to the micro level. But as we start talking about, the sort of the risk basically that we see in the world, the pandemic basically is the ideal example. If you step back to sort of the Spanish flu, it was quite isolated and contained. If you wanted to transport it anywhere else on the planet, you'd have to get onto a galleon or a ship. So on the one hand, the pandemic has shown just how effective technology is at helping spread new things. In this case, it's a virus. But yeah, when we start having a look at the level of risk within the world, basically it's increasingly global, it's increasingly systemic. It's like a massive pack of dominoes. When you have a look at the weaponization of artificial intelligence, for example, we now have robo-hackers in the cybersecurity space that can hack 100 million times faster than a human hacker. They've been coming through for the past 2 years. They're accelerating through their commercializing. We have malware in the internet now that actively goes and hunts like a sentinel for other malware to destroy it. When we have a look at things like gene editing, 2 years ago, we used a CRISPR technology in an intravenous drip, put a patient in a bed in the US. He had Hunter's syndrome, which the only good news with Hunter's syndrome is that it's going to kill you in 20 years. The bad news is it'll kill you in a very, very nasty way. After half an hour of an intravenous drip with essentially a gene therapy tool, he no longer had Hunter's syndrome. We have new technologies that can cure paralysis. Yeah, from a insurance perspective, when you have a look at the risk that these things bring about, there's a huge amount of risk. On the one hand, we can cure inherited genetic diseases with a powerful gene editing tool, but what's that going to do to that person in the long term? Yeah, there's a lack of data about a lot of these things. When you have a look at autonomous vehicles basically seem to be 99.99999% safe. They've driven tens of billions of miles, both in the real world and in the virtual world. And yeah, if you're a GI insurance provider, basically like Hiscox or LV or any of these other companies, 30% of your revenues come from vehicles and general insurance. If those cars are now much safer, premiums have got to go down, yeah, typically by at least 2/3. When you have a look at things like breakdown cover as well, electric vehicles, the electrification of the fleet, they don't break down anywhere near as much. When you have a look at life insurance, connected home increasingly provides insurers with opportunities to stop things from happening before they happen, like your pipes bursting or whatever it happens to be. But every single industry is being disrupted from the inside out. And so contagious and systemic, and there's huge amounts of risk, which we don't have data on. So that's the opportunity. And it's just going to keep accelerating and getting more complex.
Yeah, the whole data and technology and the speed with which that is going is what we are just hearing about again and again. And I think that if you're still in school and listening to this, just keep doing technology, seriously. Now, Nicola, to that point about artificial intelligence and making its way into our daily lives, you know, it's not just around the corner, as Matthew's saying anymore, it's here. And in relation to balancing that with the human aspect, you know, that companies need to be aware of what people actually want and this getting close to the customer. What insights have you got there?
Well, I keep saying the best AI is the AI we don't even know is there. And I think in terms of the customer experience, obviously there's a lot of hype in this area, but and in fact, the hype, we regularly do customer surveys around the world, just asking them, you know, questions around what they want from customer experience. And it was interesting when we typically do it every other year. So when we did it back in 2017, we released the latest one actually just before the pandemic. But 2017, 73% of customers said that they thought AI was going to revolutionize the customer experience. Now only 56% of them said that, because I think the visible part of AI that customers tend to experience are things like chatbots. And let's face it, chatbots, they're getting there, but they're not great conversationalists. And some of the chatbots have just been deployed incredibly badly. And there hasn't been a lot of thought as to how you connect the experience. So you get to the end of the conversation with the bot and it goes, I'm sorry, I don't understand. And then you've got to start again. You've got to switch channels. So a lot of the stuff we've been doing back in the innovation space is to say, actually, if you're going to deploy a bot, make sure that it actually connects through to a human being. So if it does fail, You know, you don't have to start again. You can actually hopefully start to look at parsing the conversation. So figuring out what the conversation's about, trying to look at skills-based routing that to the agent with the right skills, and then critically passing it through to the agent. So the agent can read what's happened and actually then pick up the conversation. Now that works well, but the invisible part actually tends to be what I call a me economy. And what Matthew was talking about earlier, it connects things like smart homes, IoT into AI. And what it then does is it learns about customers. And the first step for that is, well, personalization. That's invisible, but it's something that's been happening with Amazon and Netflix. And increasingly, you know, if customers give their data to you, it's kind of a transactional thing. It's a me economy. I give you my data, in turn, you personalize the experience for me. And we like that. We like Netflix. We like Amazon. Then once you personalize it, you can start to get proactive. So absolutely what Matthew was saying, your pipes are about to burst. Tell me that. I want to know. My premium is my policy is about to expire. Tell me that. I want to know that. But I want to know it through the right channel, and I also want it to be timely. And then you can, once you've done personalization and proactivity, you can start to get predictive. Now, the only problem with that is it can get creepy. So if I know more about you as an organization than you know about yourself, and you start pushing offers for things that I might have been thinking about but hadn't actually told you about, is that creepy enough for me to go, hang on, don't like that? Because this is a me economy. If I don't like it, if I find it creepy, if I don't find it useful either, or if you're just telling me stuff I don't want to know, I'm going to say you can't have my data anymore. So everything's smart, whether it's smart homes and IoT, we just turn off. And AI does not work by magic, it works by data. So we need the data in order for AI to work. So that's why this imperative, so this high hype about AI, there's a customer appetite for it, but we need to firstly make sure that humans are involved in the right places. And also when it is deployed, it actually does help the customer experience rather than hinder it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so Matthew, on that point then, the business case for diverse teams then, and involved with the development of this AI becomes crucially important. Otherwise, you're going to leave swathes of your customers behind if it's not a reflection of what they think, what they know, what their experiences are, and that's informing what you're being sold, shown, told.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, when you have a look at diversity within anything, it's, you know, on the one hand, I have to say, I actually kind of abhor the fact that we even have to have a conversation about diversity and inclusion within a workforce. Yeah, it's sad, frankly. We shouldn't even be here. This should just be the status quo, basically, and we should be able to move on, basically, and sort of, you know, live in harmony.
But the numbers tell us otherwise.
I know, absolutely. It's well, I think, you know, I mean, as you and I mentioned, I think, you know, there was a UK report that came out a little while ago that said the male-female gender sort of inequality pay gap, basically, just in the UK was going to take about 25 years to close. You know, so my daughter might be fine by the age of 40.
She'll have 50 more years in front of her to work at that point. She'll be fine.
Yeah, well, that's it, and that's provided she's not automated, obviously, by said AIs anyway. You know, so that's a sort of different conversation about humans versus AIs when we start talking about equality. But you know, when you have a look at diversity, you know, from a futures perspective, there is so much opportunity in front of the insurance industry. When you just think about the speed of change, basically what is changing, everything is changing. Step back 10 years ago and see what has changed from then to today. Step forward 10 years, basically look back at today, and you'll sort of see the pace of change. It just keeps accelerating across every industry, every part of society, every part of culture. And, you know, just like nature, yeah, if we only had one species within nature, and it was kind of like this mono species within nature, you wouldn't have basically the richness of the coral reefs and the rainforests and everything else. While we have this huge amount of opportunity in front of us, different people see that opportunity in different ways. They get a different point of view. They can bring it back in-house, basically, and have conversations about why this and not that. Yeah, and if you don't have a diverse or inclusive culture, you end up basically with this kind of, you know, monopolist organization, basically, that just maintains the status quo forever and eventually just dies a slow death. And yeah, there's so much more basically that people and organizations can give. But when we start having a look at, you know, D&I basically within organizations, it's got to be led by culture. You need strong leaders, basically you need a strong culture, basically that is an inclusive culture where people basically who don't embrace inclusivity have no hiding place. And all these kinds of things, whether you call them whistleblowers or, pipeline, escalation processes or whatever it happens to be. But fundamentally, everything comes back to culture. But as an organization in an increasingly rapidly changing world, if you aren't embracing diversity and inclusion, you're missing out massive opportunities. And if you're missing out opportunities, bringing it back to basics, fundamentally, you're missing out on money.
Yeah.
And your shareholders are probably going to be a bit unhappy about that.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So I'm very keen to get to questions because I know that we've got lots of people participating today. So I just wanted to ask you both one final thing before we get to that. Top trends. What would each of you think are, or what are the 3 top trends as you see them, or that we should be looking out for in industry generally, the insurance industry specifically? I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that, Nicola?
I'm not sure about top trends. I mean, I think I mentioned the word data, which is a well overused term, but I think a lot of what we're talking about, particularly when you look at AI, is around data. In terms of work styles as well, data's key. Some of the stuff that we're trying to do at the moment is to try and unpick, because we have a almost unique situation to be able to study a workforce that is almost entirely digital at the moment. And that's changed the way fundamentally that we've communicated. And we're seeing it from our data in terms of what's going on our network. Instantly, we suddenly spotted massive bandwidth heights for home broadband, particularly using video. So we're demonstrating that today, but actually also audio conferencing. So our platforms, our audio platforms also saw a massive surge, particularly for people that obviously either didn't want to do video or didn't have the bandwidth for it. So I think, we're looking at that data. We're also trying to look at how networks, human networks, not the physical network, but how human networks have changed as well, because the dynamics of an office is very, very different to the dynamics of a virtualized workforce. And as I said, that sort of inclusivity of conversation now isn't within a 6 meter radius of where I sit in an office. Actually, from my experience, and I know I am an individual, I am pretty well connected globally. I'm having conversations with people around the world that I probably wouldn't have had the virtual coffees that a lot of us are having. When you find someone interesting, just say, can I just meet you? And we've got frictionless meetings now. I don't have to get on a plane. So we're trying to look at, we're using data. Everything has to be about data to try and understand how all of this is shifting. And of course, the pandemic through data, wild. I know some of the retailers, particularly the supermarkets, their AI engines went a bit wild. Their algorithms went a little bit wild at the beginning of the pandemic because our shopping patterns hugely changed. So suddenly they're faced with a barrage of people are buying lots of toilet roll. Well, gosh, let's start recommending things that are based around toilet roll. And of course, that's again weird because we're having to retrain some of these algorithms because this isn't normal. It's starting to settle down and the data patterns are getting really interesting now. So again, what can we learn from that data and how do we change the way that we work, rest and play based on some of those developing data trends?
Yeah. Matthew, what do you...
So I suppose basically from my perspective, I would say, look out for the speed of change, get a point of view on it. Understand that there is a huge amount of opportunity out there across every single industry, basically from top to bottom. But then you've also got to still get close to the customer. But as Nicola mentioned, today, and as I sort of highlighted, basically just with these video conferencing platforms, we have new ways to get close to our customer. Typically, basically the insurance industry, basically will think getting close to the customer is trying to understand a little bit more about them. But we can monitor everything that you do online. We can increasingly access a whole variety of new data sources about things that you are doing offline. For example, this call, when this call is actually replayed, basically, and put onto YouTube or wherever it ends up going, my insurance company could start looking at this feed and figuring out whether or not I'm about to have a heart attack. Literally using some of these machine vision technologies. They could then tag me in that. And then
or are they?
Yeah, they can. So that's a whole conversation, but there's a whole variety of different ways. So we can either tell that you are going to have a heart attack from your voice, because before you have a heart attack, your lungs end up filling up with fluid. But another way to do it is, if I have artificial intelligence and the accelerometer in this phone, if I did that, I can give myself it's essentially a tricorder. I can give myself a checkup, but yeah, hence me saying telehealth's a sort of interesting field. So on the one hand, basically from an insurance organization's perspective, I can find more and more information about you online. There are 450 data points about all of us just on Facebook. Increasingly, I can use offline and new sources of data basically to figure out more and more new things about you. And on the one hand, for example, let's say, for example, my insurance company, say, for example, Vitality, is monitoring this feed, and it's using an artificial intelligence, and that AI starts picking up that I'm about to have a heart attack. At that point, Vitality could send me a text message saying, by the way, we've dispatched an ambulance, you know, you're welcome. So kind of like this concept of preventative. Now, from my perspective, I might think that's fantastic, because on the one hand, the ambulance is at my door before I have the heart attack and I'm less likely to die. But this is sort of why I say, on the one hand, insurance companies have got a huge opportunity to get so close to their customers that they step over a huge number of privacy lines. And on the one hand, if you can save my life using a basic technology is like the one that we've discussed, I love that. That's it. But from an insurance company perspective, if you are collecting all of this data in new ways, the benefits are fantastic, but they've got to be communicated in the right way. You've got to have proper data privacy controls. You've got to be transparent about what you're doing with that data, who you're sharing it with, what you're using it for. And ultimately, that data should be used to benefit the customer, not penalize me, such as someone saying, by the way, we realize you're about to have a heart attack, so we just cut off your cover. You know, tough.
So should we be excited about this? The questions come in. Are you excited about companies having all this information, or scared?
So this is where I'd actually flip it. I'm excited about all of this information being made available, because as an individual, people who are much more intelligent than me can help me live a better, happier, healthier, longer life. Fantastic. Love that. But when it comes to the ownership of that data, do I trust these organizations with my data? Not necessarily, which is where we then come up with a concept of things like sovereign IDs on the blockchain, basically where I'm able to monitor my data. What are you doing with it? Who are you sharing it with, and everything else? Hence my conversations about transparency. So it's increasingly, all of these organizations are gathering so much information about us that they actually know more about us than we do. That's a whole other conversation. And you're trusting that those organizations have your best interests at heart, not their shareholders. And that's the danger. If I'm just about to have a heart attack, you can either pay for the ambulance or everything else, or you can cut me off, in which case you keep your profits. Yeah, so this is where ethical business and ethical leaders really have to take a stand. And this is where we do need to sort of have more debates about regulations, policy, governance, and so on and so forth. And a lot of those conversations aren't really happening at all.
Yeah, no, not quite yet. So I've got another question here for you, Nicola, on this about the remote working. So we embrace a culture of diversity, you know, that we're doing as we're working remotely, but how can we as leaders replicate the office culture?
Yeah, I get asked that one a lot, and so there are two things to this. So firstly, what are offices for? Now that was a question we were debating before the pandemic, and actually increasingly the answer was they're for socializing about work rather than necessarily doing heads down work. And I think that's probably going to be the case in the future. But the weird thing about the pandemic is it's turned offices upside down. So why would you be in an office at the moment? Well, the likelihood is you're probably going to be in an office if you can't work from home. So I would say one of the things the pandemic has opened up is an enormous gulf between people like me, who I'm so lucky, I have a home, I have good broadband, so I can work from home. I think typically some of the interviews that we've been doing, particularly with some of our younger employees, particularly urban-based employees who are in a shared flat, literally working off an ironing board in one case, that's not great. So in terms of prioritizing who comes back to the office, because obviously one of the dilemmas that we've got with office spaces, as the pandemic is panning out, and this could be very long-term, is that we need to manage their capacity down. So whether you're doing a 2-meter office or a 1-meter plus office, it fundamentally means that not everyone can be in the office. So we're then looking at bubble teams or rotas. And also because we then have to separate people out, all of the serendipitous encounters that we always talk about the office, we're actually trying to separate employees out and not make them bump into each other, have coffee points where there's only one person in there at a time, corridors that are one way. So yeah. The function of the office flips to a place I can work rather than necessarily a place where I go to socialize about work. Now, I'm confident once we have things under control and we haven't got what someone called them hokey cokey offices, because I suspect as waves hit, we're going to be in, we're going to be out. That's why work from anywhere is really attractive, because if you enable that, you've got platforms where it doesn't matter where people work, actually. But we still have to question then, why have we got expensive pieces of real estate? And I think a lot of CFOs are asking that question at the moment. And the answer, longer term, is they are great places for collaboration. The answer, shorter term, is it's a place that someone can go if they don't have any options in terms of home working.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That makes complete sense about the reason to go there to work, as opposed to the serendipitous social talking about work, if that's what your home environment is like. And of course that is the case, as you say, for many. Another question here about what new jobs are likely to emerge in the next few years that maybe we haven't touched on here beyond technology. Is there anything else that you're anticipating?
For me, yeah, so when we have a look at the future of work and future of jobs, there's a huge amount of conversation basically about automation, obviously. Personally, basically, when I have a look at where we are really in terms of automation, whether it be AI, bots, whether it be robotic process automation, over the next 10 years, there will be some rebalancing of the workforce, but it's actually not going to be too much. You know, really, 2030 onwards, we start seeing some significant changes basically into the dynamic of the workforce, even to the point basically that the European Union put out a report last year saying that AI and automation in time basically will affect every single strata of European society, hence playing around with universal basic income. The White House under Obama basically said exactly the same thing. So at the moment, you know, when we have a look at new jobs, you know, there are always tasks to do. You know, when you fundamentally boil it down, you know, a job basically is you coming in to do a series of tasks and accomplish something or other. There are always going to be tasks that need doing. Some of those are going to be automated. Some basically are actually still going to be available for us people basically to do. But at the moment, the vast majority of us are specialists. You know, we go through college, we go through university, and we train to be the best in a particular field. You know, we enter a career, basically, we are the world's best accountant, we are the world's best car salesman, whatever it happens to be. And society basically doesn't really give any of us this opportunity to flip between one type of career in one industry and another type of career in another industry. So it's another sort of inequality that we actually have. And so increasingly, my feeling is that we end up becoming more of a jack of all trades. You know, as we start seeing individual careers dead end, yeah, organizations need to have the internal HR policies, training and skills where they are, on the one hand, they can see which jobs are dead ending. They can offer employees basically a series of new jobs, or say these are the jobs that are likely to come through. We can track the jobs that are going to be coming through in the future by using platforms like edX, Coursera, Udacity, because as there is more demand for particular types of training and particular types of skills, the trend line starts down here. No one notices it. If you take, for example, data science, in the 1980s, the trend line would have been down here. But as we go through the 2000s, as we start going through 2010, the trend line starts coming up. If you get the trend here and you can identify that this new job here is actually a trend, by the time it becomes really in demand up here, you've started training your workforce here. You're ready. You've got the skills. It's not rocket science. And then once this skill is up here and there is this demand, yeah, your workforce is ready. And you say to the accountant, by the way, we've been training you to become a data scientist because we saw it coming up. It's now here. Your job is died. Would you like this job here? And you switch them over and off we go. But certainly when we have a look at sort of to answer to the question, when we have a look at the type of jobs basically that are actually new, even innovation, creativity, and R&D jobs are actually under threat. We have machines that are innovating. We have machines that are building their own artificial intelligence models. We have machines from Microsoft and Google that are building software. So we have the automation of data scientists already starting to come through, thanks to companies like OpenAI, Baidu, Google again. When we have a look at cybersecurity jobs, basically we're starting to see the hybridization and automation of different cybersecurity roles. So there's going to be a huge amount of change. And that's before we start talking about the automation basically of transportation, et cetera, the automation of electrical grids, et cetera, from an operational standpoint. So you need a bunch of soft skills, and it's tricky. The future of job is tricky.
In all of that, at the end of the day, the transaction happens between people. Well, not always, but it will. And so, to Nicola, I know that where your heart is around the customer experience and the role of engaging in that conversation and building that relationship with that customer. Hopefully, those of us that are not specialists and are more generalists, that will keep us in work for a little bit longer.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the stuff that we've done has been around contact centers. And I always say that the good thing about looking at contact centers is that they are kind of at the bleeding edge of automation, because everyone always wants to try and automate them out of existence. And oddly enough, that has not happened. So largely, firstly, because technology like AI, as I said, chatbots are not quite there yet. So they can go up to a certain point. We've automated an awful lot in the contact center though, but people still call. And I literally mean pick up a phone, because our stats again show that people call when they're in crisis, or they can't solve problems, or get very frustrated with the digital experience. So what we typically find is, as you automate more, obviously it takes away all of the basic transactional stuff, the dull, the dirty, and the dangerous, it's often called. And it leaves us with all of the stuff actually that the human brain is pretty good at, which is why I hate the word artificial intelligence, because there's not a lot that's intelligent about it. It's great when it's got lots of data and it can model things, but it's not so great when there's chaos or uncertainty or the emotional bit that, again, we can use software to try and gauge how we're feeling, like the facial expressions that Matthew mentioned earlier. But I did quite a lot of work on my PhD around this, and it doesn't always give the machine enough insights to actually make a decision, because context can be a real problem for machines. So I call it augmented intelligence. And a lot of the stuff that we're seeing coming into the contact center space now is, it's often the really complex stuff. It's often on the phone. The agents, we can't train them constantly. So we're actually having to use AI to sit alongside them to navigate them through a vast amount of knowledge that they don't have time to go through, and we can't update their brains enough. But they can use all of the stuff that they're really good at. So anything from complex problem solving to empathy, to negotiation, all of that kind of stuff is quite difficult to automate. So I don't see it as a rip and replace. It's more around augmenting us. At least in that short to medium term. The longer term, I think the debate is often around, do you want to destroy lots of jobs? Because actually that's not great for economies. And again, there's a lot of discussion when you connect down to things like, well, do we need to work a 5-day week? Because actually the 5-day week, 9 to 5, was something that was introduced with factories, and we've kind of moved on from that. So do we need to rethink it? And New Zealand was mentioned earlier. They're looking very seriously at universal basic income, absolutely, but I would say that's the last resort. But looking at 4-day weeks and restructuring things, and that conversation is now, again, thanks to the pandemic, coming into focus in the UK as well.
Yeah, No, interesting. I've got one last question here. I'm conscious that we've got a couple of minutes, and I think it would be great to hear from both of you very quickly. Does today's industry look how you thought it would this time 5 years ago, if you can remember that far back? Have there been any surprises for you?
Nicola, do you want that one first?
Well, no, you can go, Matthew, go on.
No, so I think the insurance industry, as we look at it today, basically is very similar to the industry basically I saw 5 years ago. I think you and I sort of mentioned basically, I sat down basically with a variety of different CEOs basically from tier 1, tier 2 insurers basically in London a little while ago. And there's on the one hand, there's a huge amount of status quo. Basically, there are a couple of sort of wannabe greyhounds with the likes of Aviva, basically with their digital garages and all that kind of stuff. But the vast majority, and when I said, well, okay, what's it going to take for you to actually change the way that you work, you know, whether it's operationally, whether it's how you view opportunities, et cetera, tackle new opportunities and so forth. They all basically said, we're waiting for each other to jump. And as we see so many time and time again, change generally doesn't come from within the incumbents within an existing industry. It comes basically from startups outside of an industry who go, this is rubbish, we can do it better, we've built something, and now let's go and smash the value chain. And we've seen that throughout in multiple industries. And we had sort of Lemonade and other bits and bobs sort of coming into the insurance industry. Yeah, there's a lot of opportunity, but it's a little embracing it so far as it's a little bit snail paced.
Yeah, Nicola, one final very quick word from you. We've got
a lot of the things that 5 years ago we were seeing, so anything from telematics boxes to smart cities to home working, all were perfectly possible. I think a lot of the resistance, again, to Matthew's point earlier, is down to culture, and it has taken a global virus pandemic to actually force through a lot of those changes. I was having a conversation this morning with someone who reckoned it had accelerated digital conversations by 5 years. I would say I have seen more changes in the past 4 months than I've seen in the past 4 years. And it has had, I mean, we were talking about AI, that was supposed to be the big disruptor for the future of work. Actually, it was something a little bit more primeval and microscopic that actually did it. But it does take something to, it does take a revolution of a global pandemic status to make us rethink things. And as I've said before, we need to take what's going well, embrace what's going well, maybe discard what's not going so well, and innovate around things that are almost working. And I think that's a great opportunity.
Well, thank you. Look, both, we could talk much more. There's so much to talk about, but I'd like to thank you both for your time today.